Hello, today we'll be sewing the Gwen dress pattern together. To determine your size, please check page 2 of the instruction booklet, and for the materials and cutting plan, see page 4. We have 4 main pattern pieces for the dress. I placed them on my fabric in both directions since my fabric is a plain woven material without a directional pattern. I'll cut the upper part of the lining from the main dress fabric, and use a lighter lining fabric for the skirt. Let me show you the cutting plan. The upper section will be cut from the main fabric, and the lower section from the lining fabric. For the skirt pieces, after cutting the dress fabric, I separate the pattern along the line marked lining, and place it onto the lining fabric. And don't forget to write numbers on lining pieces, otherwise you might get confused later. Since the pieces needed for the upper part of the lining are smaller, they can be cut from the leftover fabric along the edges. I have a strip of interfacing like this, about 6 to 7 centimeters wide. If you can find strip interfacing, it will make your work easier, but if not, that's perfectly fine. You can cut your interfacing into strips and use it that way. We apply it with an iron, in strips on the wrong side of the fabric, along the top edges of dress pieces numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. Place the front pieces right sides together and pin them up to the point marked S. The marking above the waistline on the pattern varies depending on the size, so follow the line for your own size and sew the center seam up to the indicated point. Since you're already at the sewing machine, place the back center pieces right sides together as well and sew the center back seam closed. Your sewing machine settings will depend on your fabric, so it's best to test your stitch settings on a scrap piece first. I'm closing the center back seam, and then sewing the front seam up to the marked point. I'm pinning the front side pieces to the front center piece. For long pieces like these, I prefer to start matching from the waistline marks to reduce the risk of shifting. At curved areas, you can choose to ease the fabric with hand stitching if you like, but it's not strictly necessary. Similarly, I'm pinning the back side pieces right sides together to the back center piece, and then I'll sew them. This way, the front and back pieces are prepared separately. Place the front and back of the dress right sides together, align them, and sew the right side seam. Then, finish the seam allowances separately with an overlock or zigzag stitch. As you can see, the dress is starting to take shape. So far, we haven't done anything complicated or difficult. I've finished the seam allowances separately. We'll press the seam allowances open, but before that, I want to mention one small thing. I'll apply a strip of interfacing with an iron to the area where I'll insert the zipper. This step isn't mandatory, but I definitely recommend it, especially if you're using a thinner fabric that doesn't hold its shape well. I applied interfacing under the zipper area with an iron, and I also finished the edges where I'll sew the zipper with an overlock stitch. Now I'm opening the zipper and attaching it to the right side of the dress. First, I loosen the machine stitch settings and sew a temporary seam to hold the zipper in place without securing the stitches. After this, check the placement of the zipper. If needed, you can unpick it and sew it again at this stage. If everything looks correct, press the zipper teeth open with an iron. Then, using a zipper foot on your sewing machine, stitch as close as possible to the teeth to secure the zipper onto the dress. After completing the zipper stitching, close the zipper and press it with an iron. Then we'll sew the side seam below the zipper. Pin the remaining section right sides together. I'll be using a standard presser foot, sewing up to about 2 to 3 centimeters before the end of the zipper. Then I'll press the seam open and close the remaining part by hand. Personally, I find this method easier, but of course you can sew the zipper using whichever technique you're most comfortable with. Here, I started pinning from the bottom, but my recommendation is to close the zipper and start matching from the end of the zipper to make sure there's no shifting. This will give you a neater and more secure result. Now we start preparing the lining pieces. I'm joining the upper front pieces, following the same method as the dress. Then we assemble the skirt pieces in the same order. After that, we finish the seam allowances separately and press them open with an iron. Next, we place the lining skirt and the lining bodice right sides together and sew the waist seam, making sure the seam intersections match up properly. Since the straps will go between the lining and the dress, we start preparing them as well. Fold them and sew with a 1 cm seam allowance. Normally, I first tested this with satin and gave the strap measurements based on that, but with the fabric I'm using now, it wasn't possible to turn the straps the same way. I trimmed the seam allowance a bit, and they still wouldn't turn, so in the end, I had to use oil quite a lot to be able to turn them right side out. Of course, with most fabrics, you probably won't run into this issue. After turning the straps, we'll move on to joining the lining and the dress. Before lining the dress, I recommend doing a fitting. Small adjustments can be made at this stage. As I mentioned, there is a small opening where the zipper ends on the side. I'll close that by hand at the very end. I place the dress and the lining right sides together and pin along the top edges, making sure the seam intersections match. The straps should be positioned at the junctions of pieces 1 and 2. The straps should be positioned at the junctions of pieces 1 and 2. Following the seam allowance, I sew from one side up to the point where it meets the center seam, secure the stitch there, then sew from the other side to the same point to complete the seam. I didn't cut the video at the seam sections. If you understand what's happening, you can skip this part. I've finished the top seam joining the dress and lining. Let me show you in detail. I added a backstitch where the straps are attached to make them more secure. Now I'm going to understitch along the seam allowance on the lining, but I'm starting about 2 centimeters away from the zipper rather than right at it. Next, for the neckline area where we'll set the eyelets, we'll fuse interfacing pieces underneath with an iron. These pieces are approximately 3 centimeters by 12 centimeters. As shown on the pattern, place them under the spots where the eyelets will go. Before turning the dress right side out, we'll attach the lining to the zipper one last time. You can use a standard presser foot for this step. Sew the lining to the zipper up to the point marked on the pattern. Then, pin the skirt pieces right sides together, sew the remaining side seam. Trim the seam allowances at the top edge. Turn the dress right side out and press it with an iron. Finally, all that's left is the hem and attaching the eyelets. For the hem, I first fold it about 1 centimeter and sew very close to the edge, about 2 to 3 millimeters. Then I trim the seam allowance, fold it again, and sew another stitch. When you press it with an iron, the hem looks really clean and neat. Before attaching the eyelets, practice on a small scrap of fabric to get the hang of it. My press tool doesn't have a hole punch attachment, so I'll use an awl and snap pliers to help make the holes. Carefully make the holes in a controlled way, then attach the eyelets using the press tool. When determining the placement, you can adjust it to your preference or follow the pattern as a guide. The markings on the pattern are for size 34, so make sure to shift them diagonally according to your own size. Once you've threaded the laces through, your dress is complete. I hope both making and wearing it will be enjoyable for you. Good luck, and see you next time.